We read one day, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty and the possibility for the pursuit of happiness. He merely exists. Estimated that we spend $322,000 for each enemy we kill in Vietnam, while we spend in the so-called war on poverty in America only about $53 for each person classified as poor. The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home. The other thing I want you to understand is this, that it didn't cost the nation one penny to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost the nation one penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power. Yes. All labor has dignity. Yes. But you're doing another thing. You are reminding not only Memphis, but you are reminding the nation that it is a crime for people to live in this rich nation and receive starvation wages.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We are broadcasting live from Brooklyn, Left is Best headquarters, with super producer Matt Leck.
Howdy.
And head theoretician David Grishcom.
How's it going?
There you go. Super producer David Slavic. He is in the Discord, the Twitter sphere, roaming the digital universe, all part of this guerrilla operation. On today's program, Daniele Bolelli. He is the host of the History on Fire podcast, also co-host of the Drunken Taoist podcast. We will talk about one of my favorite topics and a major part of the show, hidden histories, history on fire, illicit histories, why they matter, and how Taoism and martial arts influenced his adventure. Then Bhaskar Sunkara, Michael Brooks Show crew on the socialism of the moment, what we have to learn from the Bolsheviks and the Swedish Social Democrats, and a strategy for the left to win now. All that, plus the pyramid returns, and we are throwing a global macro financial institution in it, and a very special shout out taking us to South Africa. Bhaskar stays with us through the post game. We've got some great sound and video for you. Donald Trump throwing Jim Acosta out of the White House. Out. Leave, Jim.
Be gone.
Totally unfair. All that and so much more. Plus, of course, your IMs and calls and Discord questions on the move on the Michael Brooks Show. But first, we're starting with a place that Donald Trump called a shithole. And I'm not going to focus on Donald Trump's disgusting comments like so much of the sanctimonious liberal media, although the sanctimonious liberal and centrist media is playing somewhat of an important part. There are basic baselines that we had reached as a country, which even though they were totally insufficient for confronting economic violence, for confronting systemic racism, they were a modest improvement. And Donald Trump, in his uniquely grotesque, stupid, and bigoted, and I feel like I'm living in a 1980s Queen sitcom way, is going about destroying them every day. So when he calls countries like Haiti a shithole, or El Salvador a shithole, or Africa a shithole, parts of Africa a shithole, the response that either, oh, this is him being vulgar, and how dare the president use terminology like this, or even the accurate recognition that, of course, he's an absolutely huge, grotesque racist, first, is not special to him in the context of American history. Johnson, Nixon said all sorts of racist things. Reagan, Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and Bill Clinton engaged in all sorts of racial politics. And neither, by the way, is some type of kind of easy idealization of places that really do have some very difficult economic and social conditions. Why? Well, primarily because of massive Western and U.S. intervention and abuse. And we're going to focus specifically tonight on Haiti, but you could just as easily be talking about El Salvador and, of course, throughout the continent of Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and basically anywhere else that has gotten in the way of the impulses of U.S. empire. But let's talk about Haiti. Haiti is a fascinating place. It, of course, was a country that was founded in a revolution, overcoming a slave system, expelling the French. The Haitians gained independence in 1804. The United States did not recognize Haitian independence until 1862. And they provided aid to the French fighting against Haitian revolutionaries because they were afraid that the anti-slavery rebellion might, of course, spread to the American slaveholding states. Woodrow Wilson, in 1915, sent in a military brigade and held Haiti under military occupation. Moving forward, the United States supported the Duvalier family, which is one of the most vicious, grotesque gangster families ever to run a nation. They engaged in mass killings. They were quite friendly to U.S. administrations and continued to degrade Haiti, grow poverty, and, of course, play a very specific type of fusion of capital and sort of appeals to a certain type of identity populism, which we see globally as a problem and really fundamentally counter-left. Moving forward, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was a liberation theologian, who attempted to make some reforms in Haiti, was removed by a military coup in the early 90s, which was supported by, among others, the Cali cartel that used Haiti as a transport route for their drugs in terms of their global operations in the 80s and 90s. Aristide was returned to power with the modest support of the Clinton administration, but pressured by world financial institutions as well as the U.S. to conform to orthodox, pro-corporate, pro-American policies. And eventually in 2004, he would be removed by a military coup that was, of course, supported by the Bush administration and, in fact, flown out of Haiti. And then a UN peacekeeping force, a UN stabilization force would move into Haiti. And let me just touch on a few other highlights, starting here with an apology that Bill Clinton delivered in 2010. This goes back to a program that Bill Clinton supported, which basically forced Haiti to drop tariffs on imported U.S. subsidized rice during his time in office. So in other words, it was a major benefit, and Clinton will acknowledge here in an apology he delivered in 2010 to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that he pushed a policy that benefited farmers in Arkansas and then flooded Haiti with cheap imports, wiping out a significant portion of the Haitian agricultural sector, which already devastated the island's limited attempts to have economic self-sufficiency. Here is Bill Clinton in 2010 acknowledging the era of this catastrophic policy.
Since 1981, the United States has followed a policy until the last year or so we started rethinking it, that we rich countries that produce a lot of food should sell it to poor countries and relieve them of the burden of producing their own food. So thank goodness they can leap directly into the industrial era. It has not worked. It's maybe been good for some of my farmers in Arkansas, but it has not worked. It was a mistake. It was a mistake that I was a party to. I am not pointing the finger at anybody. I did that. I have to live every day with the consequences of the lost capacity to produce a rice crop in Haiti to feed those people because of what I did, nobody else.
And even as he acknowledged what he did several years later, Haiti was impacted, of course, during Hurricane Matthew with an even greater food shortage because of those same Clinton policies. Moving forward, according to WikiLeaks releases, during the Obama administration, the State Department, under the leadership of Hillary Clinton, pressured Haiti to not implement a $5 a day wage increase, a factory that had passed the Haitian parliament in June 2009. The ambassador to Haiti at the time from the United States put pressure on the Haitian president, René Preval, at the time, and it called for a more visible and active engagement by Preval may be critical in resolving the issue of the minimum wage and its protest spinoff, or risk the political environment spiraling out of control. Haitian laborers make products for companies such as Fruit of the Loom and Levi's and rely on paying that country incredibly cheap wages. The United States, arm in arm with the garment sector, the Obama administration, the Clinton State Department, pushing to keep those wages low and substandard, even as Clinton was on his way to apologizing. That same UN force that was in there after the removal of John Bertrand Aristide, which was in fact a coup, which in fact activated paramilitaries and gangs in Haiti that received support from the Bush administration and others. That same UN force, as you'll see in this Al Jazeera clip, on the event of their departing, or at least somewhat scaling down, was responsible for, among other things, a massive cholera outbreak in Haiti, which killed thousands.
The UN is also left having to clean up a number of problems which it created, including a cholera epidemic caused by its own troops, which killed more than 9,000 Haitians.
It was about time for them to go. We are better off without them, and we will be fine. The UN was here for its own purposes, not to help the most vulnerable Haitians.
I think things are getting worse in this country. Everything's more expensive, and you cannot trust the authorities to do anything. Things are so bad, I think that only Jesus can help us.
The stabilisation mission will be replaced the day after its mandate ends, on October the 15th, by a new, smaller 1,300-strong UN force that will work to improve Haiti's judicial system.
And of course, there are corruption allegations that plague the current Haitian administration. There's no change in policy, of course, from the Trump administration in terms of laying siege to Haiti and trying to exploit its resources and acting at the behest of U.S. corporations. The only difference is, of course, stripping protective status for Haitians fleeing from an earthquake and a complete failed recovery that had temporary status in the United States, in absolutely an act of distinct human cruelty and racism by this fascistic, disgusting, grotesque, bigoted administration. They need to be taken on in every way, shape, and form, but don't listen to all sorts of people sanctimoniously calling them out for profanity when the whole history of our policy and relationship to Haiti has been nothing but one of imperial vulgarity, exploitation, and abuse. Those in temporary protective status must stay here. We must fight against them every step of the way, as long as all the other immigrant populations that are being racially attacked in really white supremacist, almost Nazi-esque ways by this disgusting administration. And we should never let people who have the good sense to not call places shitholes and seem to have like a bare minimum of crossing out of base racism get away with their support of quote-unquote woke, abusive, and in fact fundamentally racist and exploitive policies. Guys don't even have anything to say. It's the kind of rant I went on. How late did we start today, guys?
Like 3-4 minutes.
Only 3-4 minutes. All right, so let's get to the and apparently the spin right now is that some Republican senators that are sort of saying that he didn't exactly say shithole. Apparently, the spin is that there's debate as to whether he said shithole or shit house.
I think we call that a distinction without a difference.
Yes, and this is, of course, but you know, Dickie Durbin was there negotiating, so good for Dickie Durbin for blowing the whistle on this scumbag. But I don't know what kind of deals he's willing to make with these thugs. The Democrats should threaten to and hold the line on shutting government down over clean DACA and not run interference for these people in any way, shape, or form. They're disgusting. They're incompetent. They're white supremacists. They're counter history. They're counter anything. That even, I mean, when you even have Don Lemon coming out on TV and being like, they're racists, I mean, you're done. There's no subtlety to it. But by that same token, I know that the Clintons have come out and used all the right verbiage to describe just how disgusting these comments about Haiti and El Salvador and everywhere else are. But I think it's also quite disgusting to act at the behest of Levi's and Fruit of the Loom to keep people in starvation wages. And it's disgusting to support the Divaillés. Aristide is back in Haiti and politically marginalized. Let's get to the shout out. We have Birdman. Birdman is just taking on a life of its own.
Let me give a shout out to Miss Gladys, my little sister Tamara, my daughter Magnolia Shorty. Rest in peace.
Any guys more thoughts on the Magnolia Shorty name for your future daughters? And of course, I want to give a shout out to an organization in South Africa that I'm sure Birdman was thinking of when he made this track, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, which I know in many interviews Birdman had said inspired this track. It's a Marxist-Leninist union organization that represents the metal workers of South Africa. They broke off from the Tripart Alliance, which backs the African National Congress several years ago, in 2013, because of the ANC's support for neoliberalism and austerity. And they now say that they're fighting the sort of next forms of economic violence and oppression, that they're confronting the new forms of apartheid through class struggle in South Africa. So what this union does is it is rooted in the deepest traditions of radical unionism, of radical democracy, and was part of the historic struggle against white apartheid in South Africa, but it is now pivoted from an ANC government that has embraced global capital and has now devolved to just immense capital corruption under Jacob Zuma's really grotesquely corrupt administration. Cyril Ramaphosa's taking over the ANC is a billionaire and potentially implicated or at least involved through his encouragement in the killing of wildcat strikers at the Marikana massacre. So South Africa needs a renewed independent class struggle, and this union is doing it, and we want to recognize it and give them a shout out. The National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA. Check them out. And check out, patrons, for future Illicit Histories. There's stuff coming up both on Haiti and on independent union movements and their relation to the politics of the moment. We're going to do the pitch, and then we're going to get to my friend Daniele Bolelli. And then, of course, Bhaskar is coming on. Where else are you going to get conversations with some of the most interesting people out there on everything from Taoism to Trotsky? The answer is nowhere. And by the way, it's true, and everyone says it. We are at 900. I think we're at 979 as of showtime. We want to cross that 1,000 number. I am working on the scripts for those animations. We've got some new group calls coming. We've got that Discord. That Discord, things are happening on the Discord. I think marriages are being formed. I think conspiracies are being hatched. It's a live, thriving community. We all drop into it from time to time. Of course, I do Q&A there about once or twice a month. We're thinking about setting up a special Grisham Q&A on the Discord. He's ready to get in there.
Good idea.
Sounds like a good idea. Look at him sitting back in his leather jacket. Sounds like a good idea. Sounds like something I can take on. Get some Johnny Cash playing for you, buddy. We are on the move. We are not beholden to anyone. We're only beholden to you. We're growing, and I think that this information and what we put to all of you, not only, I mean, it's meant to entertain, it's meant to inform, it's meant to enlighten, and it sometimes actually really create a basis for the type of strategic sense, empathy, historical awareness, and really kind of broad instinct for the actual elements that we need of a movement now, a new left movement now, to actually regain power and create new forms of not only resistance, but actually winning and a better life for all, for the many, not the few. I want to thank each and every one of you so much. Stay tuned for all of the things on the Patreon. Also stay tuned. We're working on putting some live shows together. That's something that we're getting together as well. When you become a patron, you get more than twice the content. Please keep spreading the word. I just heard, what was it, Grisham, you were telling me that a distinguished professor is digging the show. Are you just drawing a blank? You told me that you turned your friend's family onto it?
Noam Chomsky.
Noam Chomsky is a major fan of the Michael Brooks Show.
Yeah, we've got a good amount of neuroscientists who are really
also
into the show
no,
these days.
except they're real academics, not like Sam Harris people. Yeah, no Sam Harris. Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky actually said that. Well, I don't want to say what he was saying about rival podcasts. It was pretty harsh.
Pretty profane.
Yeah, but he's a huge
The
fan
locker
of the
room
show.
talk.
Yep. We're coming after all of you. We're coming after Howard Stern. We are on the move. I want to thank each and every one of you so much. We will be right back with Daniele Bolelli on the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is one of the most interesting people in the game. His name is Daniele Bolelli. He is the host of History on Fire podcast, the Drunken Taoist podcast. He's a professor of comparative religion and a martial artist. He's a genuine Renaissance man. Daniele, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Daniele, as you know, because we've talked about this before, so for people who are patrons of my show, and sometimes we release a bit when we sort of unlock certain content, kind of tease it for people, there's an ongoing series that I do called Illicit Histories. And the exploration, whether it's Silicon Valley fascism or whether it's about what the CIA was doing in Jamaica with gangsters in the 1970s, or you know, the history of Charles Murray's ideas and why they're so odious and dangerous. History can give us this it's almost like a topic that's taught so dryly, but it actually does give us a context for understanding every part of how we're living our lives today. And an alluring way of doing that is through the illicit and the unexpected. And you do that on History on Fire, oftentimes in the ancient world, but also in Native American history and other places. And I just want to know if, does that kind of description resonate with you? And what inspired your historic work? Where does it come from?
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense what you're saying. I'm amazed actually that so many people manage to make history boring, because you really have to try hard. It's like there's so much good stuff in it. There's crazy passion, heroism, horror, drama. It's all in there. It's the whole human experience is part of history. To me, if you're talking about history and it doesn't sound like Game of Thrones, you're doing it wrong, because real history is Game of Thrones, just minus the dragons. I used to say minus the dragons and the White Walkers, but then I actually saw pictures of the Republican convention, so I know the White Walkers are among us.
Yeah, they're here. They're here. But they're a little less fit at the Republican convention, but yes.
Yeah, but that's what history looks like to me. That's what I find fascinating. I mean, I don't care about history for history's sake. I care because it's what it really means to be human. You find that you can tap into the experience of thousands and thousands of other people by studying history. And so my job in that sense is just digging for little gold nuggets of information in monstrously boring historical text, and then put them together in a narrative that actually makes sense and somebody would want to listen to and doesn't make them want to shoot themselves. And it's really not that hard to do, because the stories are epic. They are right there.
What are some of those stories that you've been exploring?
Heck, let's see. The latest one, I just finished doing a 3-part series on the life of Jack Johnson, the first black guy to become heavyweight champion in boxing. Mm-hmm. And here is a guy who had, at the very beginning of the 1900s, was making a living, beating up white people in the ring, sleeping with white women, doing things that in 1910 were not exactly, they would fly down easy.
Right.
So he's a hilarious character. He's just extraordinary in every possible level. And so, you can make the story boring. It's already amazing as is. I did a series about a lady at the beginning of the 1800s who she was a former prostitute and then became the head of the biggest pirate confederacy in history. She had 60,000 people at her command, and ended up forcing the...
What was her name?
Well, that's the funny thing about it. You figure somebody like that, she must be super famous. We are not even sure of her name. They refer to her as the widow of Qing. Like, they refer to her by who she was married to before that guy died. So they refer to her as Qing Shi, but that's not her name. They're just saying the widow of Qing. And so it's crazy how some things get even lost in the historical record. But you can gather pretty easily that there's something amazing there. There's something, in 1810, she managed to bring the Chinese government to its knees, where eventually they said, look, what do we need to do to make you stop? And she's like, you give me and all my men a pardon, and we get to keep all our money. And the Chinese government signed off and said, by all means, go ahead, please retire now.
So, and how is somebody like that documented? It's just accounts, like in government records at the time. Like, there's this person who's taken over this giant pirate fleet, and she just keeps fucking with us. There's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
That's
there's
amazing.
not, as you may imagine, governments are not incredibly fond of writing about people kicking their ass. So there's a little bit of that. But then I think one of the sources that you could find, she kidnapped this one official from the East Indian Company, and this guy was their prisoner for like a couple of months. So he wrote a diary, and there's some of it in the diary. There's, fragments here and there. So you can put together the story. But yes, pirates are not exactly known for writing their history, and governments who got their ass kicked by pirates don't really want that to be super well known either.
You also did one in ancient Rome on the slave revolts. I thought that was fascinating. I mean, it was also just, really genuinely brutal as well. I mean, just horrifying, but also like, when you tell these stories, you have, even though you don't, it's like you're talking, giving the story. There's not a lot of production, but the way you tell them, they're so captivating. Your senses are almost there. And I am interested, I guess, in that through line that like you are telling it from the perspective of kind of like the outlaw, the oppressed, the underdog, the exploited, and then re-engineering it from that perspective as well, which does tend to make it more interesting.
Yeah, of course, those are the people that I'm interested, right? I'm not, I'm interested in characters that tend to be a little bit off the wall, that are that don't exactly toe the line or live by conventions. You can definitely sense a pattern there. The people I like are not the most normal kind of people. I think I used that line I was doing this series about Crazy Horse, and I used the line, "You don't get to be a legend by being normal," and I think that applies to a lot of these people. Yeah.
This will take us into your path a little bit in the Taoism and the martial arts piece. But where did this feels like a cliche, but I went to Italy when I was a teenager. It was my first time leaving the United States. And I went and I was able to spend 2 weeks in Italy. And I've experienced this other places as well. I mean, there is just a much greater sense of continuity in Turkey, in Italy, in the UK than you get here. I mean, there is a continuity here, but I mean, part of the continuity has been genocided. We went and totally wiped out a group of people when we arrived. But do you think that it's a little bit more instilled if you're growing up in a context where just even like visually you're reminded of what came before? Or conversely, is it kind of like, all right, that's a tourist trap, who cares, whatever, this is what people fly in to kind of look at and gawk at, but I don't care because this is just where I grew up?
I think there's a little bit of both. Yeah. One end, you definitely are exposed to things where, when the history is not 300 or 400 years old, but you get stuff that's from thousands of years before, and it's right next to the spot where you go to school, or you are, of course, the past and the present intersect a lot more, just because there are a lot more centuries of stuff there to go by. I mean, even people's houses. I've been in people's homes that are 1,000 years old, even more. Wow. And it's not that weird over there. And so that, by the way, is a trippy thing about houses in U.S. tend to last. They are built to last a couple of generations at most. And
at most. At most.
And usually not even.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's sort of like, what are you talking about? We did a nice 20-year run on
houses
this.
There, it's like they are supposed to last for centuries, and they usually do. So it's kind of funny how it's set up. But yeah, even that, I think, is part of the setup. The United States was a nation on the move from day one. There was this idea of an expanding frontier. So you don't build stuff to last because you're not going to be there 50 years later anyway. And, there's more this idea of movement, whereas places like Italy are more rooted, which is both good and bad. There are advantages and disadvantages, but there is the idea that where you are is where you're probably going to stay. So it better last a long time and be well built. And some of it, I was more interested in other history than Italian history. Italian history, I really didn't care because, as you said, it was what I had under my nose all the time. I did like other kind of history. Now, when I moved away from Italy, I started liking Italian stuff a lot more.
What was the path? I mean, I'm just fascinated by this. I have my own background, as people, kind of generally know, doing a lot of Buddhist meditation practice, some other practices as well. I'm always trying to figure out and wrap around in my sort of sense of thinking of the moment, because on one hand, I think especially, in our context, and so much of this show is about really trying to ground a very materialist political understanding, which is totally lacking, especially in the United States, but also has global implications in this sort of hyper capital and redesigning and reforming and really reclaiming, I think, economics and common space. And I also think there's so many fads and so much, I mean, you know, there's this hyper rationality right now, especially I think in the spaces we're in, which in some ways, in a lot of ways, is very healthy. I mean, first and foremost, the reaction to the kind of all various forms of religious fundamentalism and so on, but even also to, you know, various new age fads and other kind of woo-woo stuff, which just kind of exploits people's, I think, actually real incredible existential pain in capitalism. That's my sort of read of it. But but I think that there is also this element of, and even when you're reading about people like you know, even like a Nelson Mandela being a kind of very prominent example, there was these sort of inner capacities that people developed one way or another to sort of match the moment, so that in the broader sense, there's all these material conditions running our politics and our life and everything else. But there still is a kind of, there still is an interiority that is relevant to people, and some of the ideas and impulses that do come from things like, you know, Taoism as an example, I think are incredibly compelling and relevant to figuring out our predicament. So I'm just curious. I mean, first, I guess, big picture, I'm curious if you kind of buy that, but I'm also really interested in, you know, how did you discover, you know, martial arts and Taoism, and how does it kind of fit into your arc and your way of looking at these things?
I think, yeah, I agree with your analysis. I think reason is an excellent tool. It can be the only one, because there's a lot about life that cannot be explained purely through reason. So I'm interested as having it as an important tool in the toolbox, not on relying exclusively to it in an almost dogmatic kind of way. And in that sense, I do dig, I was always more attracted to, I mean, there were certain things in Western philosophy that I liked a lot. Guys like Heraclitus were really interesting. The madness of somebody like Nietzsche was super fascinating. But I started digging a lot of the paradoxical quality of philosophies like Taoism a lot more, not because, I mean, mainly because they spoke to me as that's the universe that I see outside the door when I look around me. That, to me, they explain the way things are a lot better than anything else I can think of. So to me, Taoism is not something that is, you need to learn Taoism to. Taoism is something that if you pay attention, you probably understand already the basics. And it just gives you a better read on it. But it's not revealing something that anybody who's not paying attention is not going to see in the world around them already. In some way, you don't even need to be a Taoist to be a Taoist, because to me, Taoism is about a recognition of just principles that on which the universe is based. So that's kind of what I find interesting. You know, so many different philosophies or religions are, you have to believe in them, you have to kind of study and buy into it and all of it. Taoism seemed to be just nature, just the way life is. So I was always very fascinated with it.
You've been talking more because you also have this Drunken Taoist show, Drunken Taoist podcast, which I'm looking forward to very much to being on, and I really enjoy listening to it. I mean, do you find that in that kind of that the conversation that you're setting, and you also have this Taoist lecture series, that you're sort of finding a way to bypass both of those kind of dysfunctional tendencies in that conversation, and sort of that the sort of the, you know, the new age game, which I know you don't do, and then also the sort of you know, I think, yeah, these potentially very limited or dour conversations about things that actually could be potentially a lot more paradoxical and interesting and relevant to people's lives in terms of how they actually kind of function. Because that's the other paradox of it. There's a lot of kind of material that comes out that it's like, it might be philosophically very compelling, but what does it have to do with how you actually sort of conduct yourself? And for all of the sort of far outness of it, it's actually potentially very relevant for how you actually conduct your life and do things.
Yeah, that's what interests me. I don't care about Taoism for Taoism. I care about in terms of how, and that just doesn't apply just to Taoism, to everything else as well. I care about things in the measure that they can elevate the quality of life. Otherwise, I don't care. It's really not that big. There are 3,000 rabbit holes one can get into for intellectual nerdiness, but what's the point? I'm not really that interested in it. I'm only interested in things that can help make life more interesting, more meaningful, happier. That's what it's about. All the other stuff. That's why I'm not married to any one idea or ideology for that matter. I'm interested in what works. And if you can show me that an idea that I disagree with deeply can be used well, at least part of the time, hey, I'll take it. Maybe I'm not going to make it my way of life, but maybe 10% of the time, if it works, I'll use that for the 10%. I have no position to borrowing from any source. I don't have an ideological approach to things. I have a very practical approach to things. If it gets the job done, if it makes people happy, I like it. Tell me about it. Let's figure out how far it can go, where it can lead, and then I'm good. And most things, they usually have their place. In some cases, it may be 0.1%. In some cases, it may be huge. But there's usually always a tiny bit which can be used in most anything, really.
Before we go, Daniele, and we have many conversations ahead of us, but there is a certain person, and I realize, I think you've spoken about this publicly, so I don't feel like this is totally coming out of nowhere, and I know we've talked about this privately. There is a certain little twerp that is an enemy of this show that you had dealings with when you were at a very prestigious university in UCLA. I would like to get the history on fire historian, Taoist translator, religious writer, philosophic inquirer, and martial artist, maybe more to the point, because I wish you used some of these skills to throw this guy in a locker where he still should be to this day. But you actually met Ben Shapiro, and you still have an optimistic view about existence?
Yeah, he was, I think he was an undergrad when I was a graduate student at UCLA. So I was there around the same time. And, I wasn't exactly a big fan. I mean, just on a brief interaction, I was, I can go into 10,000 stories, but I think the bottom line is some way exactly what we're saying before you even brought him up is the argument about ideology. To me, the problem with guys like Shapiro is that they are married to an ideology. You know what he's going to argue before he even starts speaking, because he's going with the same program every single time. Doesn't matter what the evidence is. He's going to argue a super conservative viewpoint. Exactly what. So it doesn't matter how things change, how things evolve, what the topic may be. There's a blueprint that he's going to follow, regardless of reality. And that, to me, is the problem with ideology, that even ideologies that may be correct part of the times are never correct all of the times, let alone the ones that flat out suck most of the time,
Like
but
his.
To me, this...
Right.
Precisely. But to me, that's the problem. Is like that's why I like guys like Dan Carlin, for example. You listen to Dan Carlin speak, and you never know what his conclusion is going to be, because he's taking in facts and letting he's gonna make up his opinion based on conflicting evidence that he keeps getting and analyzing. Most people, Shapiro included, make up their opinion and then figure out how the facts factor in. And that's just simply, where I come from, that's not what you call intellectual honesty.
Or if you're like me, you probably know where I'm going to get, but I'm going to do it in a really entertaining way, which is also pretty good.
But the thing about you're probably going to know where I'm going to get is that there's still a degree of nuance.
Yes,
you can have a certain position that you can stick to just because, that's your experience in life. That seems to be where the truth tends to hold most of the time. That doesn't, it's kind of like, it's almost a stereotype these days, but I'm sure you've heard this idea before a million times. But the concept that if you know somebody's stance on global warming, you also know their stance about abortion and immigration, is ridiculous. Because those are topics that don't really have necessarily a whole lot to do with each other. So that seems to be when, you can have a super clear stance on one issue, and it may not exactly be that the same stance that a particular party or ideology supports on another issue, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
I think that keeps it interesting.
No, I think it keeps, and I think it's a whole other distinction too between you can have a coherent issue set across a whole bunch of issues, but the way that you get there and the manner that you articulate it for a broader sort of public is really important. And that's something that I think actually we're dealing with a lot in my sort of zone of politics on the left, which is like, you know, and on like the real left, I would say, like on like a more socialist left, which is, first of all, what does this look like for a kind of broader, you know, populace, basically? Like, so how are you actually looking? How are you actually branding yourself? And then number two, yes, I think that you can generally sort of have enough coherence where you probably are going to get to similar places if you look at things through like a you know, a class structure as an example, which I do. But I think that it is absolutely a different process and a more demanding one than just having a pre-fit outcome and then we sort of all shout at each other. So it's actually another kind of paradox, and I make a lot of jokes about it, because on one hand I'm like, oh yeah, I'm totally closed-minded and I have no interest in anybody's ideas, and it's true. But then at the same time, I want us to all do this in a much more rigorous, interesting, and engaged way. Let me just say, I want to remind everybody before we go, as I say, this will be the first of many conversations, and everybody could find History on Fire podcast, which I love, as well as Drunken Taoist, which I am a regular listener to both, and I really appreciate your time, Daniele.
Thanks, man. Thanks so much for having me, and yes, we shall continue the conversation.
Yes, sir. Be well. Daniele Bolelli, everybody. All right, here's what we're going to do. Yeah, there's no graphic for that. There's just music this week. So what we're going to do is Bhaskar Sunkara is going to join me now.
You want his music?
Yeah, come on. Sorry?
You want his music?
Yeah, we can play some music while he comes on. Yeah. Yeah, this is your music, Bhaskar. Welcome to the show, brother.
Hey, I probably shouldn't have moved this. This is the first time I ever tried to move the mic in this show.
No, you can move it.
It's good.
Feel comfortable with your instrument, man.
Get it up as close as you need it.
How's it going? How's the show been so far?
The show's been good. I thought that. I mean, I'm a big fan. I like Daniele. I think I love his podcasts, and he's a good guy.
Very soothing voice. I like.
He's got a very soothing voice. I remember when we first met, I said, I really like that guy who talks about Taoism, who sounds like a Mario brother. and then we became fast friends. And then my opening commentary on Haiti was fire. It was fucking great.
Were you pro or anti?
I was anti, and I didn't want to have my expected ideological position. So I wrote it. No, but I think what's interesting about that kind of ideology conversation is I think that, like, there's a way in which, especially if you reduce it to kind of like the cable news talking head variety, there's truth to it, which is that people who kind of like, you're going to defend Trump, you're going to be offended, that is actually pretty boring versus like actual analysis. Now, on the other hand, if you're just doing contrarianism and false equivalency, that's crap.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also the idea that there's some people who are ideologues, but they're so rigid that you know that they're about to have a profound crisis of faith. You know, and they're the worst people to be around. Like the anti-abortion activist who now is a feminist, worst person to be around. And also the other way around.
Oh,
too,
yeah.
Right? Like the anti-abortion activist who used to be like a free-spirited feminist 5 years ago. You know, so I like to think that I have enough deviancy in my politics that I could kind of bend but not break and not become the next, you know, Ben Shapiro or something.
Well, I think that's actually what he's saying, which is really useful. Like I think it also affects how we come across to a broader public, which I just think we need to start thinking a lot more about. Like, you look at these, I don't know the importance of kind of like how major all of these various Twitter battles are, but sometimes I just think of them from the perspective of like, okay, I'm coming completely from outside of all this. I don't know what DSA is. I don't know what, you know, I have an instinct. Maybe I've heard that socialism is actually a positive thing. Maybe I have a sense that there's a political program that's really serious about delivering for me. And then the first thing that I see are like these interscene call-out battles. And regardless of the merits, I mean, it's just not. How is that going to forward us?
Yeah, just bizarre. I mean, I myself don't notice or see half the stuff. And if I'm this enmeshed and I don't see it, I think anyone can kind of will themselves to using social media the right way. You know, I generally respond to friends, or I'm friendly to strangers. I tweet about sports. You know what I mean? Just try to do other things other than just obsess. And when I see someone say something stupid, normally I just let it go. You know what I mean?
That's again, I think that's actually kind of the Taoist path. There's a certain Taoist theme to this.
I feel like I forgot what Taoism meant in like the 6th grade or whatever. It came up on some social studies.
You took Taoism in 6th grade?
It came up on a social study quiz. You know what I mean?
It's a classical Chinese religion, and I believe the Tao Te Ching, I think, is the 2nd most translated book in the globe after the Bible.
It's a real shit because they stole Buddhism from us. They turned Buddha from a starving Indian to a fat Chinese man.
Well, Zen Buddhism is like the fusion of Indian Buddhism with Chinese Taoism, supposedly. And the Chinese are a little more practical. They were all I remember I was talking with a couple that I spent some time with, and it was funny. And she was of like a Brahmin background in India, and his family was Chinese, and like. And the family was all making it work, but they were talking about like the meal, like how on one hand, like hers was like, you know, teaching him like, okay, everything's vegetarian and this spoon can't touch this, like, you know, like kosher plus type food preparation.
Who are these Indians using spoons? We don't use spoons in our household.
Oh, okay.
You're eating soup with their hands.
This hand doesn't touch that hand or whatever. and then she's like, and then when I had his family, like I'm in the car and there's just like pig feet around me, like just surrounded, like and they're like, why don't you eat pork? It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lower caste Hindu, so I don't eat beef, but I eat plenty of pork and.
I
other
totally
meat.
don't understand that. I don't understand.
Well,
you go from like, well, I guess that the cow is friendly. I understand that, but like, just the idea that you would go to like the absolute dirtiest food from like it's swine, man. I guess I have enough Islam.
You became like a black Muslim recently. You're like,
when did I become one? I think I've been on that brand for quite some time.
Came out as one.
Yeah, I came out as if I would like to announce to everybody, I'm a black Muslim. You heard it here first on the episode, I believe, 24 of the Michael Brooks Show. Allahu Akbar. Those Nation of Islam Obama impressions have been. I can't take it anymore. What he says is what I think. White devil. Let's do a pyramid. Do a pyramid segment, Bhaskar. I didn't know you were going to come in time for it, but are you familiar with this Chile story? Let's set it up this way. That Chile, apparently the World Bank downgraded Chile's doing business index during the regime, Michelle Bachelet's administration, right? You familiar with this story? So basically, and she's in power now, right?
They just had an election.
They just had an election which she won, I believe.
I am not certain what happened in the second round. I followed the first round very closely. There was a left-wing kind of populist formation that won about 20%. But I thought that the favorite in that election was a center-right, actually. So maybe
Pinara, I think.
Yeah.
Right. No, I think you're right. I think can we double check that? But yes, I think you're right. I think it's Pinara is the current president of Chile. And yes, right. Michelle Bachelet's administration was by no means significantly to the left at all. She was running like a mainstream sort of. It's Pinara now, right? So Chile is run by a center-right to genuine right formation. It goes back. Some of the people in the administration do go back with connections to the Pinochet regime, as far as I know. And I think Pinara is a business guy. So, but what a World Bank economist, the bank's new chief economist, Paul Romer, told the Wall Street Journal Friday is that Chile's recent slide into the doing business index was due entirely to the methodological changes that could have been politically motivated and not by the deterioration in the country's business environment. Romer released figures Monday that showed that that would have happened in Chile's ranking without the changes. So basically, the charge here is that when her government was in power, they basically rigged the numbers ostensibly because they didn't like even her, extraordinarily gentle, kind of moderate, herbivorous socialist government.
Yeah, why have the center left when you could have the right in power?
This is also, though, at the same time that, like, every couple of months there's, like, seemingly, like, the Guardian loves running those counterintuitive headlines where, like, the IMF and the World Bank have released a new report saying that austerity doesn't work, or we should try a new approach in Greece. Go ahead.
So there's a lot of tension within these bodies, especially the World Bank. There has been a lot of center-left economists that have made some headway there. There's a lot of people who just say the common sense, not even from a radical standpoint, but from a Barack Obama standpoint, from what the Fed did during the Great Recession here, the kind of more expansionist kind of monetary policy and whatnot. And clearly, like, what happened in the U.S., how the crisis was handled, was just objectively better than what they did in Europe. So there was a lot of economists who had made that point. And it is true that some of these institutions have changed a little bit compared to what they used to be in the 90s, just as far as, not in from a socialist perspective, not in a progressive way, but just in terms of incorporating more voices from the global south, more of these BRIC nations having more say in the bodies and whatnot. So that's a general kind of thrust, at least what we've been hearing about changes in the IMF, World Bank.
Right. But without those kind of policy follow-throughs. So we still get these situations like with Chile of jiggering with the doing business index.
Well, there's no fiscal shock therapy when a nation's doing too much austerity, right? It's not like we're coming in, we're cutting off your access to credit unless you start pumping out more in demand spending or something. There's none of that.
So yeah, I guess what had just happened is that PNR had just got reelected, in 2018. So the numbers were, started to slide before his new term. I mean, do you think is this one of those things, like, are these institutions that should just simply be abolished in the ideal scenario, or could they be international macroeconomic instruments that were, like, at least social democratic or Keynesian?
Well, let's see. I think the solution to kind of progressive government isn't just an autarkic solution, right? We can't go the Albania model and, like, have under Hoxha.
What's wrong with the Albania model?
under Hoxha, Trump's next wife maybe might be an Albanian model.
Could be. Could be.
Under Hoxha, they just built a bunch of bunkers. Like, literally, it was a bunker socialist state. But, obviously, countries are going to need access to credit, right? Obviously, there's going to be a degree of trade. We're in a globalized economy. I think there has to be national.
Supranational.
Wow.
Bhaskar making news. Jacobin founder calls for supernatural Marxism and global supernatural institutions. Mamma mia.
That could be a thing, actually. That could be a Twitter account.
That wouldn't be.
But yeah.
Supernatural.
The specter haunting Europe. But yeah, I mean, I think there needs to be some sort of bodies like that. I think they would just be governed very differently. And also, I think that we have to reconceive of how we need to relate to the global south. So in other words, do these countries really have to go through this long, agonizing process of what Marx would call primitive accumulation, of just building up the productive resources?
Can we explain a primitive accumulation to people? I'd like that definition.
Basically, just the early stages of taking mostly agrarian or mostly peasant economies and turning them into industrialized, economies. So this essentially means kicking people off their land, like you're seeing what's happening in China, and a very brutal process of urbanizing people and putting them to work in factories, and all these other this dislocation that
stuff that free market ideologues of every stripe, from like the kind of conventional to the ultra libertarian, the stuff that's just sort of like on the house. Like, yeah, well, then we just sort of had a market. It kind of spontaneously happened, versus this very organized, or not necessarily organized, but very socially constructed thing that literally created a market.
Yeah, being a worker sucks, right? Nobody wants
Right.
to be a worker and spend all day working in cramped factories subjected to the whim of one guy. If you have an opportunity to live off the land or do something else, you'll do that. So in a
Right.
way, this process in the broad sweep of things is historically progressive. So it created all the stuff, all the wealth that we really appreciate in society, that's laid the foundation for every huge innovation of the last 150 years, and I think it's been a good thing for humanity in this kind of abstracted way. But the question is, today, with all this wealth in the world, do we really have to have all the countries in sub-Saharan Africa go through the same bloody, protracted process?
Right.
And obviously, even if they wanted to, it wouldn't even be that simple with how the world is divided between rich countries and poor countries. Or can we just subsidize their development? Can we go to Ecuador and say, Ecuador, you're one of the poorest countries in the Americas, but you're blessed with a ton of gas and other reserves. Why not pay them? And this would they even recommended under Correa. Why not pay them not to dig it up?
Right.
I don't want Ecuadorians digging that stuff up and polluting,
that
creating greenhouse
idea,
gases, but
it goes, even Al Gore in Earth in the Balance in the early 90s recommended paying Amazon rainforest countries to not log.
Yeah.
That idea is an incredibly mainstream idea.
It's worth more to the world to keep those trees up, to keep that stuff, those resources in the earth, than it is even in just material terms. There's a case to be made. And I think certain countries like Norway, like Iceland, these countries would surely agree, but you have countries like the US or Canada. Canada portraying the tar sands is one of the most destructive environmental things happening, and there's really no reason for such a wealthy, industrialized country to do it. So in other words, I think there needs to be avenues for credit for countries to actually develop, but I think countries don't have to go through the same exact cycle of development that we had in the global north to get there.
And in the meanwhile, before we redesign global development, we will sentence the World Bank, who is a long-term nefarious actor in the global south, and with this jiggering of numbers in the Doing Business Index in Chile under a centrist government from 2014 to 2018, we sentence the World Bank, even though Bhaskar is an ardent defender of theirs, to the pyramid. I'm so into the music, man. So that's the type of thing that we could be like actual socialist policy of the moment, right? And you have this recent piece that we'll get through a little bit, where you're talking about what we have to learn from the Russian Revolution, but then also Sweden's 1976. Is that right? 1976 government?
Yeah.
So talk about the Bolsheviks first, and bring your bio into it. What made you a socialist?
So yeah, I became a socialist when I was very young. I didn't really know.
The Dookie Howser of socialism.
Exactly, the Dookie Howser socialism. Unfortunately, to my father, like all Indian parents, he wanted me to be a regular doctor.
Can I develop a sketch of your father that will be recurring on the show, please?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
Go ahead.
I'm definitely going to be working on that.
I want 15%.
Well, you can get more if you agree to role play. If you're like, Dad, I'm reading this book on Trotsky. Oh, no. Oh, no. What about Bill Clinton? He's trying to help the people. Why can't you be like him? I like how your dad's from Trinidad. I'm just giving him...
No. My dad is actually an Indian man who moved to Trinidad. My mom's real Trinidadian Indian. So my dad's like...
Oh, perfect.
It's very rare.
So like my impression is perfect.
It's like a Parisian deciding to move to Montreal, then marrying a French Canadian. It's kind of it's an unusual thing. I'm sure it happens every year, but,
It is not that unusual. You must not be a communist. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
So, my dad actually he liked Castro. He likes.
Oh, okay. So your dad, of course, your dad's cool, naturally.
But
I've heard stories about your dad. He's obviously cool. Yeah.
Yes. He does like Bill Clinton too, but yeah, for me, I discovered this when I was, I don't know, like 7th, 8th grade.
After your Taoism social studies?
After that Taoism social studies class, the next thing I did, I think this is a really nerdy middle class way to get into politics. I'll just admit it.
Dude, it's fine.
But I think I read Animal Farm around then. You know, Animal Farm's all around. You know, it was meant as an anti-communist kind of parable or fable, not by Orwell, but by, you know, why disseminated around U.S. school districts.
Right.
And I remember reading it being, well, this first guy, like Snowball, or whatever his name is, sounds great. Then I read the introduction.
Snowball crushed it.
So then I looked up Orwell. I read Homage to Catalonia. From there, the introduction to it said that he was fighting in a militia associated with the Trotskyist or Trotsky-ish POUM.
Right.
And from there, I decided to start reading some Trotsky. I ended up reading the Isaac Deutscher trilogy. So my parents rented into a good school district. And the reason why we rented into a good school district was...
So you could become a communist.
Well, it was so pro-Semitic, the rationale, that it's almost anti-Semitic.
Your parents have one of those, like, if the Jews are going to run the world... then by God, you'll be educated with them.
Yeah, basically. or basically, like, you know, like...
They take education very seriously, okay? Very serious.
That is true. That is true. So my dad, you know, he the way he puts it is that, you know, he just arrived in the U.S. Most of my mom's family was in, like, East Orange or Newark, New Jersey. So he was around there. And he's just like, wow, this place... like is like the third world. This is
not good education.
This is like the late early 90s. It was a rough area.
Yeah, no, that's real. You got to go find what the Jews are.
So he went up and he found a Jewish man. He said, "Hey, I just came to this country. I want to educate my children. Where should I move?"
That's
and the guy said, "Move to Long Island or Westchester."
And that's great. The average Jewish schmuck, he's like, "Well, you want to go? I would go to Long Island or Westchester."
Yeah. So we rented into a good school district, and the reason why these school districts are so nice, you know, is because of property taxes. So if you're renting, it's like a great loophole. So seriously, if anyone's out there and they're really stressing, you know, they have a kid on the way or a kid about to go to a school district, they don't want to deal with New York City, whatever, just look into renting a place in like Mount Vernon, White Plains, or something like that. Hawthorne, you know, there's plenty of places where,
really smart.
You know. So anyway, in our library, partially because the town that I grew up in had a pretty big Jewish population, and a lot of the benefactors to the library, I guess, were Jewish. There was lots of Irving Howe and there was lots of Isaac Deutscher, and they were donated by like Jewish cultural associations or Red Diaper Babies' parents died and whatever. So even though by no means was this a radical town, the library's literature was tilted very far to the left. You know, there wasn't anything really on the right there. So I would, after school, waiting for my mom to come home from work, you know, spend 2-3 hours, you know. I would spend the first hour hanging out with my friends and the last 2 hours reading Trotsky by myself.
That is amazing. That makes total sense.
So I discovered the left, and I discovered real politics from saying, this is awesome, but this is just a fictional fantasy. How does this actually work concretely? So then, you know, there was the anti-war movement. You know, when 9/11 happened when I was in 7th grade, so the anti-war movement's really getting going there. So I got to go to real protests and see other things. But in a way, a lot of people say, you know, they're a radical, they're revolutionary, they're a Marxist in their heart, but in their heads, they're a moderate because they know better. I was kind of the opposite, where in my heart, I really wanted a welfare state. I really believed in social democracy. But then in my head, through reading, through looking at history or whatever else, I realized that, you know, these experiments have been undermined because if you try to, let's say, run up the score against capitalism, but you don't change the rules of the game, then, you know, a lot of those, sorry, this is a mixed metaphor.
No, but you're playing on another team's turf.
Right, exactly.
You're playing on,
so you need to structurally change the rules of the game or the playing field or whatever. So that was my first encounter with it. So when I say that today I'm not a particularly sectarian leftist, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the Russian Revolution, I don't spend a lot of time on these historical questions, kind of because I already spent a lot of time with them. So I'm not saying that other people interested in these things should not be interested in it. You know, I think you should read and understand everything. So what I was trying to do with my piece is basically explain the whole arc of the Russian Revolution from before the revolution, the early 1900s, until really like Stalin's rise and after. to give kind of a primer, a synthesis on how to understand the Soviet experience.
So what are those lessons from it? I mean, what strikes me, just as a couple of kind of random, I mean, sort of Snapchats, is that, I mean...
Are you on Snapchat?
Sort of. I have an account,
are you on it just for, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
but at a certain point,
I'm off it. My girlfriend wasn't using it right. She was using it to like send me photos of like empty milk cartons and stuff, like kind of a to-do. I'd be like, oh, Snapchat. And it'd be like, oh, I need to go to the grocery store or whatever.
That is so emasculating.
Yep.
Oh my God.
Yep.
It's horrible. I just was like, look, if you're gonna send the picture, send it so it lasts. I don't need this 10-second disappear thing. I mean, if you want it, it should be durable. I think that like in our imagination, it's sort of like, okay, we all have a general understanding, and all like, I mean, we can complicate Stalin historically somewhat, and I love and am a major participant in Gulag humor, and I do think it's great, like telling, like Jonathan Chait's like, college campuses, and we're like, dude, you're going to be fucking locked up. And he's just like, you're kind of proving what I'm saying. Like, I like that genre. It's very fun. But actually, of course, like in reality, I mean, of course, this was mass atrocities, mass murder, mass killings. And then out of that, essentially a kind of, a bureaucratic state, which protected a party apparatus. But at the same time, I think people's, one is to deny the history and try to create a counter narrative, which is a fool's errand. But on the other hand, first of all, there's the actual lived and true success of an actual revolution, overturning of an order, which is profoundly inspiring. And then there's a lot of things that happened in between that we should learn from. So I guess, I mean, does that kind of read make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think that to begin with, what I was trying to do with my piece was at first to dismiss this narrative of the martial Bolshevik, this idea that Lenin was like, what's his name? Tyler Durden. What was it? Brad Pitt's character in Fight Club? Tyler Durden. Like he was creating some sort of like hardened
You should get a good Snapchat picture for that. Nice pull.
So some hardened like cadre, some sort of like group of people that were just going to launch a coup and take over the system. They were professional, hardcore revolutionaries. I try to dismiss that and say that what Lenin was trying to do was create a mass, broad-based workers' party in a country where all that stuff was very illegal, where the Tsar, after the 1905 revolution, like killed 30,000 people. This is a very brutal, very repressive government that was extremely reactionary in everything. I mean, people forget that the Russians were still using the Julian calendar until after the revolution in 1917. This is how backward, they were. They wouldn't even like accept leap years, I try to dismiss that while saying that the party over time, once the revolution happened, which was broadly popular in many ways, the parties of the center left and the parties of the center in Russia had won a mandate after February 1917, the first revolution. It was a mandate for a democratic revolution, for land, for bread, for peace, and they were unable to fulfill that mandate. So over time, their support eroded, and Bolshevik support grew and grew and grew. And eventually the Bolsheviks decided, led by Lenin and Trotsky primarily, to take, and a lot of them opposed this idea, to take a gamble and try to take power. And at that point, they were in a situation where they knew that they could hold on for a little bit. They could try to do some reforms, but they really needed help from abroad. They wanted to be the spark that would end the war, a war that already had killed over 10 million people, end the war and bring revolution to Germany, to these other countries. The gamble failed, but I think the gamble was justified. Not knowing what we know now necessarily, but knowing what they knew, following the logic, it's not as nearly as bad as a lot of people would say. But then I think over time, like as kind of a state that was isolated, they had to do what they had to do to survive. They faced a really brutal opposition. I would say that the way I put it is that there was two alternatives for Russia, three alternatives really. The Bolsheviks could have stayed in power. You could have had, at best, an interwar, a dictatorship like you had in interwar Poland, like a kind of a pretty hard, heavy-handed military dictatorship, but nothing extreme. Or, on the other hand, some sort of like anti-Semitic genocidal state, and already there was mass pogroms by the white armies. There was already the return of widespread mass anti-Semitism and attacking of racial minorities, all this other stuff. So it was a really chaotic situation, and over time, what they had to do to survive, it's kind of a cliche, would change them, would change the party, which would make it bureaucratic. It was kind of an environment where the most brutal and direct and coercive people like Stalin, would rise, and people with more sophistication, with more nuance, who were grappling for the right solutions, like Bukharin, like Trotsky, would fade away. Then you end up with what you end up in the Soviet Union, which was, the only layer of society left untouched or growing or surviving was the bureaucracy.
Right.
The workers' movement was dead. The peasantry was destroyed. This was.
But this is
it.
so important because that wasn't right, and everybody. And do you think that it's not formal, but like the informal conspiracy or indirect conspiracy, or just the analogy of, by the time we move from Stalin through the kind of bureaucratization, and then their attempt to formalize into a science what Marxist dialectics was and turn it into this kind of like weird, some type of like, I don't know what the right word is. But
kind of a Scientology thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like a Scientology system instead of a system of political analysis, potentially political strategy, but certainly nothing doctrinaire, something very diverse, something intellectually rigorous.
And also something that tells you some things about the world, but not everything about everything.
Yeah, because that's simply impossible.
Yeah.
And it turned from this kind of like a cult management system of everything from justifying mass murder to like the proper dialectic way to like train your kid how to brush their teeth or whatever.
Or understand genetics.
Genetics, exactly. All of this insanity. And then at the same time in the United States, there was the effort by both government agencies and plutocrats here both to kind of, literally put a lot of muscle in and a lot of, violence and brutality and money, which went back well before the founding of the Soviet Union, to physically destroy labor movements, but also to make Marxism that ridiculous thing that couldn't be part of intellectual discourse. In a way, they ran on a parallel track because at the same time it's becoming this silly cult apparatus in the Soviet Union. That's how the elites here want it to be seen amongst people that would read and think.
Right, and I think that's definitely true. I mean, the only thing I would say is that the Soviet Union, both, I think, from the perspective of democratic socialists, both kind of ruined a lot of these ideas, but it also made it really relevant.
Yep.
If you're in the third world, so I mean, that's the other side of the coin. Like, the Soviets themselves were really bad, but a lot of the people they inspired, they the old woman handing out daily workers at the corner who just wanted to end segregation and lynching in this country, to people struggling abroad, people like Nelson Mandela struggling for national liberation abroad. Like, the Soviet Union was really an example.
The Soviets were funding the ANC through the 80s. So even that great liberation that everybody wants to take credit for, that's still a Soviet-funded.
Or even the East Germans. And the East Germans are real, nasty, particularly authoritarian variant of this system. But if you think about this, the biggest German military operation since World War II, actually might be Kosovo now, but it was for a while 10,000 German or something like that, thousands of German military advisors in Angola.
Yep.
And a lot of those Russian tanks that was given in Angola to fight the apartheid South African government and fight, before that, the Portuguese, manufactured in Germany. And you could say that, this is the 70s. So a lot of these people's fathers were in the SS or doing all sorts of other things. So you could say that there was something profoundly progressive about some of the international role, but domestically, I mean, it was really just, there's a story that I have about I actually haven't put this into writing yet. It's going to be in my very forthcoming book. I need to write the thing. But I have a friend. She's a biographer of Victor Surge. Her name is Susie Weissman. She studied for a while.
Susie Weissman, what a nice girl. Got a Westchester, Long Island. Sorry, go ahead. That's just a perfect name.
Susie Weissman.
Susie
I guess
Weissman. So. That's your daughter. Susie Weissman, very good. She's a very strong student. You can tell by her name.
Actually, I generally throughout high school and whatnot only dated Jewish girls.
Did you now? This is an interesting question. A dad approve or disapprove?
My dad actually he approves because my
not Indian only.
Yeah, well, my dad's first wife, when he was married at like 1920, was in fact a Christian, which was very taboo for the time. And even my grandmother and my grandfather had love marriages. So my family has a tradition of no arranged marriages.
Love marriages, Christian marriages, the rowdy, erotic Sunkaras here on the Michael Brooks Show. All right. Anyways, back to communism.
But
go ahead.
Anyway,
Susie Weissman has a story.
She studied, I guess, in Eastern Europe. I think maybe in the Soviet Union, and she had friends who, either in Soviet Union or East Germany, I believe, started a Lenin reading group in the early 1980s. And they're of course kind of trot, but they're believers in communism. They started a Lenin reading group.
Right.
They were put under state surveillance for a suspicious interest in Lenin. So this to me, if a right winger got hold of this would be like the hook of every single piece about the Soviet Union. So I'm going to be the first to push it. This is like the epitome of what Stalinism was about. The official ideology was Marxism-Leninism, but if you were actually really interested in the ideas of Marxism, Leninism, then you were a possible subversive.
Well, I always find that fascinating. Like even when you read today, like if you read a profile of Deng Xiaoping, and it's like and then he went off and did theory and ideological training and like studied Marx, and it's like, how could what does that have to do with the governing strategy? Like, I understand some of it makes sense. Like, I'm sure, like, there's very sophisticated training for governance inside the Chinese leadership. But like the notion that this had something to do with like reading capital, I mean, maybe in terms of
it's
effectively,
like someone who studies the Bible, right?
Right.
Or a philosophy student who studies Hegel, right?
Right.
It's I think not necessarily something where you get a lot from it. I don't mean in a spiritual sense, but you get a lot from it intellectually in seminary school, memorizing verses or whatnot. Right. But it's more training your brain, training yourself in the system, right?
Yeah.
And I think Marxism was kind of that for a lot of these members of the nomenclatura.
Take us to Sweden in the 1970s.
So basically, if you think about it this way, socialism was there was this attempt to kind of create a sphere of socialism outside of capitalism. So this is by kind of some fluke accident of history. The workers' movement in Russia, in the Eastern Bloc, gets detached from the rest of the workers' movement elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere around the world. And they have this attempt, right, that becomes over time, morphs into the kind of communist system. But there was also still these movements that were struggling for power within capitalism.
Right.
And in the same way, you could say the Soviets accomplished some things that we should probably take as an example, right? They created huge planning apparatuses, all these other things, and generally, for whatever reason, some of them were real socialists, some of them were just Russian nationalists who wanted their friends and family to like have access to consumer goods and whatnot. These planners made experiments, right? And we can learn from this. And I reject a lot of planning. I'm kind of slightly more of a market socialist based on this experience, but you can learn something from that. But in the same way, you could learn from these movements that even though they didn't go beyond capitalism, they radically transformed capitalism. They radically pushed an arrangement that would have been unthinkable, where over half of the social share of wealth was going to workers, where there was collective bargaining across entire capitalist sectors, where a lot of life was decommodified. And by that, I just mean taken out of the market. Yep. So in other words, if you're a Swede, even to this day, you still have the right to healthcare, to education, to childcare, to this kind of cradle to the grave protections, where, it still means you're in some way, you're in a dog-eat-dog economy. You have all these competitive pressures, but it also means that, if you lose, it's not a matter of going on the street and starving like it is in this country or a lot of places. You get the chance to bounce back and retrain and do something else. It's a radically different sort of society than what ever existed, elsewhere. I think it's kind of the high point of human civilization in that regard. Just the idea that, you know, every little boy, little girl is born actually has, you know, you could say with some assurance, if they're born in some of these Scandinavian countries with a welfare state, you could say with them some assurance that they're not going to, you know, go to sleep hungry. They're not going to do these kind of things. So that's what I mean, where I want a left that really understands the radical history, what went wrong, what went right in the kind of communist tradition, but also understands and appreciates how hard it was to get that, because it wasn't just given to us, right? We had to fight for it for decades in these countries. And even in the U.S., to the extent we have some a welfare state, to the extent we have even universal suffrage and democracy, and we obviously still have racism, but we don't have people swinging from trees. This kind of stuff took struggle, right? So that's what kind of I want. I want a left that understands both the communist tradition, social democratic tradition, and then tries to build something new for the 21st century with that lesson.
Where does I'm assuming you have very little sympathy. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I think one of the things, and this could be even just the difference of like a couple of years, but when I don't remember exactly. I mean, it was certainly well before I could vote, but it was like my political awareness kind of spiked around 1999 and 2000 and those World Bank, IMF, WTO protests. And on one hand, it was incredibly important and inspiring because it was a reminder in this time of just sort of like triumphalism that there is, first of all, that there's still real problems, and even if they're not being covered in all of the sort of like breathless coverage of the stock market, that they're out there, and then that people are organizing. But there was this kind of, these different currents. I think a lot of the people protesting were either, there was some good, just sort of genuine progressive and kind of labor Democrats, which I have a lot of respect and sympathy for. But there was this very big anarchist tendency, which I actually do have some sympathy for. I think there's value in having it in the debate. But it did seem like there was this reaction both to the Soviet experience and this sort of like over lesson that like politics just this like, and we saw it of course in Occupy, but the obsession with decentralization, the obsession with there not being this kind of understanding of struggle and power, and then even to the point where some people, I mean, I'm sure if you pin them, they would probably support some type of Nordic vision, but in some cases even then no, because there's this notion that that was top down, and it almost started to sound like a kind of lefty version of kind of like woolly-headed libertarian Silicon Valley thinking. I think that the left actually did lose some time, and it's some of the problems we see today with all of these arguments getting out of hand and this obsession with flattening. That sort of tendency through the 90s, to its credit, it kept some left alive, but to its very much to the detriment of us, it got so not serious about power.
Well, Jody Dean has this line that I like. That's like goes something like, "Goldman Sachs doesn't give a fuck if you're raising chickens," and I think that's one end of it, right? Like you're not it emerges out of defeat because it basically says we can't challenge power head on, so instead we need to find resistance and cut cracks. Like we need to build our alternative where capitalism isn't watching,
and there could be value in that.
Right.
And it could be a beneficial personal decision. And I'm not demeaning it, but that is not going to win.
But on the other hand, what it did, though, what it did was kind of, and this is where I actually think there was a lot. I think the anarchist movement, if you were to ask me in 2008, 2009, what I thought about its legacy, I would have been very negative. But I think as a result of Occupy, you actually saw that was out of a creative wellspring from the anarchist movement. That was them actually just getting out there and saying, you know, whatever, we're just going to do it, right? We're just going to go out, we're going to get in some encampment, we're going to do it. And sometimes all you need is people in motion. You need people trying to do something and trying to create this fissure, create this break, because the rest of us with our kind of more, objective kind of long-term patient view, we weren't getting anywhere.
Right.
But the anarchists really helped punch a hole through, in which now I think they're the victims of their own success, and that now people actually really want big alternatives like Bernie Sanders. They really want parties like Podemos. They really want like a more coherent vision, and they want people to fight for power to actually get them stuff. But without them creating that opening to begin with, we wouldn't have got there.
Yeah, I agree.
And also beyond that, I do think there was a time when anarchism, let's say in the 90s, or even today, the kind of ad buster style anarchism does drift into a complete lifestyleism, right?
Yeah.
Like if you actually look at ad busters,
I don't watch TV.
yeah, but next to up there with Jacobin, it's one of the best designed publications on the left. And you know why it's so well designed, and it's actually kind of a joy to flip through.
Because they took branding and advertising seriously.
Because it's an anti-consumerist publication, but it has a visual flair of a consumerist publication, and essentially, they're still selling watch ads. You know what I mean? If you like, but so there's that kind of like lifestyle vision that I don't think has any political teeth. But then there's also, Spanish anarchism in the 1930s, right?
Oh, well, that's
then there's actually that real like syndicalist or union-based anarchism, and it's still alive in places like Greece with their kind of these social networks they create in Greece, solidarity networks. It's still alive in Argentina. It was, at least, with some of these occupations and activities. And I think today in the U.S., our anarchism is not quite as bad as the lifestyle stuff was in the 90s. And I think a lot of these people can work productively in broader movements. So in a way, I think there is the more ridiculous parts of it, but there are the parts that we owe a lot to.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I just think there was some trouble, even with people who actually overall have a lot of like. I like Naomi Klein. I think Naomi Klein does really, really valuable work, and I respect her writing. But I think there was some tendency in people who had that platform in a certain period of time to sort of de-emphasize a certain type of power engagement. But I think that was, but I don't think it's even really a critique of them as personalities. I think that was just like, I have no doubt if I had that platform at that time, I'm almost certain fall to some of the same mistakes. I think that was just what was available.
Well, even now, like I still do a lot of, I like Naomi Klein's latest book, and she was kind enough to have me. I did like 4 or 5 events with her during her book launch, which was great because they're packed houses, and of course, like 5 people are there for me, and the other 900, 95 for her. But one thing is, once you get this big platform, and it's not just Naomi Klein, it's lots of other people, you feel the tension because these are very smart people with lots of critical faculties.
Yeah.
On the other hand, they have this big audience, and people want validation, right? So it's hard to be the person up there. And to some degree, I do it a lot, and that's the reason why I have some audience, not a huge audience, But, it's to tell people that, like, what you're doing, what you're thinking, like, it's not quite enough, right? We're not getting there. To tell people that, the powers arrayed against us. We're going up against the strongest, most stable, most ideological legitimated ruling class in history.
Yep.
And we have like a handful of us, right, with all our abilities. And in a way, it is pessimistic, right? But in other words, I think we need that reality in order to figure out what it would actually take to get to the next level. So there's a tendency, I think, and if you read like publications like The Nation, publications like I won't keep naming publications, but they're hard to read because if you were to just read them, you would kind of think that we're winning. And
or that I don't know if you think we're winning, you might think that like, I mean, I guess this is me being deeply, or like if we're winning, whoa, this is what winning looks like. We're never going to win.
Right. But on the other hand,
yeah.
You could veer it. What would, if they just acted like I would act, then what would it do? It would just like demobilize and people would just be not enthusiastic. So obviously there's some sort of
dialectic
balance, but there, Perry Anderson says, better to have sober analysis than rosy reports from the front.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to take that sort of snapshot, I mean, do you think that the kind of the lane that is most effective, Bernie Sanders, Corbyn, Podemos? I mean, there's something to it.
Well, it's effective to get to power, right?
Yeah.
But once they're in power, the constraints around them will be this thin. I think Corbyn, to some degree, the people around him have some sort of idea of what kind of pressure they're going to be under from the state apparatus, from more importantly from capital, from all these other questions. I think
they're already talking about it. You read that Financial Times
exactly
piece about people getting ready to move their capital and holdings out of the country.
Well, what I mean, our side is talking about it too there, right?
Yep.
Like, I think there's
Right.
some people around Corbyn that are thinking about these things, and Jackman's engagement with the UK left is partially to push some of these conversations, but it's not really happening here or elsewhere. We're going to have an interview with Bernie Sanders in the next issue where we ask him some of these questions.
That's right, you little prick.
Yeah.
You ready?
Yeah,
You want to go
yeah.
to the Jew neighborhood to get a good education, you little fuck?
Hey,
you don't think I can handle the presidency?
Hey, Bernie Sanders was born back when the Jews were working class and playing stickball.
You're goddamn right.
Yeah, he's
Smack a
still
stickball in your
lamenting
face.
the Dodgers. I should have asked him about the Dodgers.
Here, ask me a question. Ask me a question, as Bernie. Go for it.
How'd you feel when the Dodgers left town?
Shut the fuck up. Trying to throw me off my game by depressing me? Little prick.
Your Bill Clinton's a little bit better.
No, it's good. My Bernie's good.
Your Bernie's good.
Well,
Your Bill Clinton is marvelous.
Well, I have the same, like, I have a similar, like, voice structure, I think. To, like,
Your
Bill
Nelson
Clinton,
Mandela is beautiful too, because at first
Just
I used
so
to think,
wrong.
no, I thought your Nelson Mandela was a little bit like off. I'm like, he sounds a little bit like Indian, a little bit too Indian.
A little Indian.
And then I listened to Nelson Mandela. I'm like, Nelson Mandela sounds a little Indian too.
I do sound a little Indian. Like your father running around for love marriages.
No, it's that. It's a running around part.
Running around. Trying to get Christian tail.
Wait, did I ever tell you why my grandmother was a Christian?
Schools.
Ever tell you the story?
No, tell me.
All right. So my great grandmother had like 3 or 4 miscarriages.
Oh.
So then some white woman, a missionary, not just a random white woman, went to her. And this is in like Trinidad, and said,
which part of Trinidad, by the way?
This is like near Sandy Grande. It's Komodo,
Okay.
in the east-west corridor. That's a deep cut that like about one of your listeners might appreciate.
I've got some Trinity listeners. I've spent some time there.
So told her, if you promise to give your child a Christian name and baptize her and get baptized herself, she was pregnant again. This child will live.
Wow.
So she did, and her child was named like Amy. And which is not even in the Bible. I don't know where the fuck is Amy from.
Really,
but anyway,
that's just like pure colonialism.
Just like a white person.
That's just not even. That's just like if you name your kid a white kid name, it'll live.
And she lived, and she was a Roman Catholic or something. She wasn't even like a regular like it's a British colony, but she was a Roman Catholic until she was like 17, 18. She got married to a Hindu. We kind of just forgot about it. We still have Jesus up in some of our homes. It's just one of the gods. It worked for a while. We were on a hot streak with Jesus.
That's the big Hindu advantage.
Yeah.
Is just the absorption.
Yeah.
All right, here's what we're going to do, folks. We are going to take a few-minute break, and then we're going to go to the post-game. We have sound of Jeremy Corbyn. We have sound of Donald Trump throwing Jim Acosta out of the White House. I love that you are still totally on, just pure team enjoy Trump. You're totally still on team enjoy Trump.
I am not. Trump cost me money, man. You know how hard it is to get work visas for Jacobin employees now? Oh, my God.
Jacobin, what? Again, we have had another Patreon surge. Thank you all so much. I don't know exactly where we stand right now, but we're very close to that first 1K.
A couple weeks, it seems.
Each and every one of you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you, super producer Matt. Thank you, David Grishcom. Thank you, super producer David Slavic. This weekend, Bill Fletcher Jr. on the Jesse Jackson 1988 campaign, the Rainbow Coalition, the illicit history of that campaign, and why it is a blueprint for leftist electoral strategy.
He's Guyanese.
Bill Fletcher Jr.?
Yeah, his family's Guyanese. You should ask him about that.
I will, actually. We've been talking a lot. Last weekend, illicit history on Charles Murray. The Bell Curve, did that with Nathan Robinson. Stay around for the postgame. 646-257-3920, 646-257-3920. The IMs will be on. The Discord is humming. See you in a few minutes.